Welcome, everyone. My name is Anna Grzma-Bousse. I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies, and it is our great pleasure today to welcome Melanie Kamet, who is a renowned expert on the politics of the Middle East and on the politics of patronage and political economy more broadly. Melanie is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Brown University and a faculty fellow at the Watson Institute. She's the author of two very well-regarded books, Globalization and Business Politics in North Africa, and Compassionate Communalism, Welfare and Sectarianism in Plural Societies. She has also written numerous award-winning articles that have been published in the top journals in the social sciences. Her work explores state-business relations, the impact of globalization and state development, and the ways in which religious and other private groups decide to award social benefits to their adherents and to others. So please join me in welcoming her today as she gives her talk entitled Patronage, Politics, and Sectarianism in the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Can you all hear me? I don't know if I need to stand near here. So what I'm going to talk about today mainly is a forthcoming book, the book Compassionate Communalism that was just mentioned, although the press hates my title, so it might have a different title shortly. We will see. And then what I'd like to do is lead into some questions that this research raised for me that are leading to some new research projects I'm just embarking on. And then we'll have plenty of time to discuss, I hope, and if there's other things you want to bring up about politics, welfare, and so forth in the Middle East, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. So I'm actually not talking about the Arab Spring. You're probably Arab Springed out, but we can talk about that too if you'd like. Okay, so let me just describe what I was focusing on in this book project, and I'm not going to get into too much detail here, or I'll try not to. I'll describe the logic of the argument, and then some of the findings, and some of the kinds of evidence that I gathered. So what I looked at really was the politics of social service provision and its relationship with the dynamics of sectarianism, focusing mainly on a bunch of political parties in Lebanon. And more specifically, I wanted to understand how these groups distribute social services, social benefits that they provide privately. And so some of the questions I looked at were community level questions. So why is it that some sectarian parties reach out across community lines to serve other religious groups, and others instead focus more exclusively on their own in-group communities? Why is it that the same group might vary its welfare distributional patterns over time across communities or more narrowly within its own community? And then on the more individual level, I looked at why is it that some groups focus more on core activists and others focus more broadly on maybe marginal supporters or even people that don't have much of a track record of supporting them. And I should mention that in a context like Lebanon, core activists tend to be from the same religious community. This is not unique to Lebanon. We see this in ethnic party voting elsewhere, of course, as well. Today, I'm just going to focus on two of the groups that I looked at. The predominantly Sunni Future Movement, which is the political movement of the former Prime Minister of Lebanon who was assassinated in 2005, Rafiq Hariri. It's now nominally run by his son. And the predominantly Shia organization Hezbollah, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. And just to cut to the punchline, the Future Movement has tended to distribute welfare and social services more broadly across communal lines and to more marginal supporters, while Hezbollah tends to concentrate on the in-group members and distributes the largest array of benefits to its core activists. So why is this the case? And I have two arguments that I develop in this book, one of which I'll focus on today in particular. So the first argument is it depends on the type of political mobilization strategy that the party prioritizes. So when a party adopts what I've called state-centric mobilization, it tends to give more broadly to other communities. What do I mean by state-centric? I'll talk about this in more detail in a second, but basically when it operates largely through formal state institutions, contests elections, that kind of thing. When a party mobilizes or prioritizes mobilization through extra-state channels, so not really contesting election, not prioritizing contesting elections, but more, mobilizing street protests and maybe in the extreme militia politics, then it tends to focus more on the in-group community and has less out-group provision. The second argument, which I'm not going to get into today, has to do with the degree of competition within the sect. Those of you that are familiar with studies of ethnic politics, maybe Horowitz's work, are familiar with the sort of outbidding dynamic. So when there's a lot of competition within a particular ethnic or religious community for political representation, then you get a kind of outbidding dynamic that compels organizations to favor their own, so to speak. When you have less competition for political representation, then there's more leeway or freedom to reach out beyond the group. And I'm not going to focus on this second argument so much today because the organizations that I'm looking at, the Future Movement and Hezbollah, both were dominant within their respective communities. So we'll just focus on the political mobilization strategy argument. Okay, so very briefly, I know this is a lot of material here, so let me just summarize. This is a more developed description of what I mean by state-centric and extra-state. I've basically described the general contours of that to you. So state-centric, working through formal state institutions, in particular electoral contestation; extra-state, not participating in the executive branch, mobilizing sit-ins, riots, militia forces, and so forth, and more generally adoption of militant tactics. And each of these strategies generates more likely actions by hardcore supporters or by supporters of the party. So when a party prioritizes state-centric mobilization, you're likely to see it call upon its supporters to vote for it, to mobilize voter turnout, to attend meetings, and that sort of thing. Extra-state mobilization, of course, involves things at the extreme like participation in militia politics, and these involve different investments of time and risk. So the horizontal axis here in this diagram is risk, the vertical is time investment, and so the lowest risk, lowest time investment activities associated more with state-centric mobilization are things like mobilizing voter turnout and voting for candidates and voting for party lists. And on the other extreme, in the upper right quadrant, parties call upon their activists to engage in much higher risk and more time-intensive types of activities, in the extreme serving in a militia. So how does this relate to welfare benefits? Well, arguably, these kinds of political behaviors are associated with different types of social benefits. So when your supporters are engaging in higher risk, higher time-intensive activities, you're more likely to give them more comprehensive and more continuous packages of benefits. And conversely, when supporters are engaging in lower risk, lower time-intensive activities, they're likely to get smaller, sort of more short-term benefits, like packages of food or cash handouts or that sort of things that are more mobile and so forth. So what are these two arguments I outlined earlier, political mobilization strategy and intra-sect competition, suggest for how parties distribute benefits? Well, I'm going to focus just on that bottom two quadrants there, because we're looking at parties that have low competition for political domination of their communities. When a party's engaging in a state-centric political mobilization strategy, it's likely to have a more inclusive distributional strategy that involves both in and out group members and distributes benefits more broadly. When it's prioritizing extra-state mobilization, you see more exclusive patterns of distribution that favor in-group members and, at the extreme, core activists within the in-group community. And so, again, I'm focusing just on these two parties, but the book focuses on a number of different parties, mainly in Lebanon, and some of these parties adopt different behaviors in different historical periods. So So you might see them in different boxes at different times. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Okay, so let me just give a little bit of background, because I would imagine that many people here don't know much about Lebanon and have no idea what I'm talking about in terms of the context where it occurs. So I want to say first a little bit about the political system, because this is quite relevant to some of the arguments, since the institutional features of the state are particularly relevant in shaping a state-centric mobilization strategy. Lebanon is a case of a power-sharing system, and all kinds of political offices are allocated according to sectarian identity. The political system institutionalizes sectarian identity in terms of, the president, prime minister, speaker of the parliament, and so forth go to specific members of specific communities. But this also translates into offices in the civil service and so forth. So this translates throughout the government. In terms of the electoral system, it's a majoritarian system that is one that we call joint electorates with reserved seats. What does that mean? It means that in any given district, there's a quota of so many seats that have to go to candidates from different sectarian communities. So let's say you're in the district of Baabda in the southern suburbs of Beirut. I can't remember the exact distribution, but there's a couple of seats reserved for Christians, a seat reserved for a Sunni Muslim, a seat, I believe, reserved for Druze, and so forth. And so we know that people from those communities are going to be elected to those posts, but importantly, everyone who votes in that district votes for all of those seats. So parties have an incentive to attract the votes of people from other communities, not just from their own. Okay, and so the welfare regime, I think it's important to put this in context. Why are all these parties able to do all this stuff? And so I want to just give a little background on that. Lebanon, like basically every country in the Middle East, has a long history of non-state provision under the Ottoman period, under colonial rule. Religious organizations were particularly important in providing welfare, also missionary groups as well. And in the case of, whoops, that's not what I meant. Okay, let me just get back to where I was going. Well, you're getting a flash preview of everything. Okay, so in the case of Lebanon, this role of non-state actors was actually preserved and consolidated after independence, and so you have a lot of provision by non-state actors, especially these sectarian parties I'm talking about, but also religious charities and NGOs and so forth. So lots of non-state provision, actually a pretty minimal role for the state, especially in the health sector, but even in education, where half the schools are public, but in effect a lot of religious and political groups control even public schools. And after the Civil War, which ended in 1990, militias that were active during the Civil War, even in providing social services and in some cases collecting taxes, consolidated themselves, turned themselves into political parties, and some of them developed charitable wings that are the focus of my research. So very briefly, the Future Movement, this is the predominantly Sunni group I mentioned. It has a charitable wing called the Hariri Foundation that officially runs virtually all of its charitable activities, except, interestingly, its food distribution program, which is very important. That is run by the political party, and food is a big item that is distributed during vote buying season. So it's very interesting that the Hariri Foundation doesn't run the food distribution program, but it runs everything else. And it has a lot of what I've called bricks and mortar agencies, more than 31 clinics, although I'll talk about the end, how that is changing very recently. Sort of a hospital. At times, the Hariri Foundation, the Future Movement, has controlled this public hospital, the Rafiq Hariri Hospital. At other times, it hasn't. It runs 5 schools, and it has a university. It has a food assistance program, which I've mentioned. It has other programs that deliver material assistance to to beneficiaries. It also has a lot of ties to charities in the Sunni Muslim community that are not ostensibly part of its network and that are not officially political institutions. And officially, it claims that eligibility for its programs is purely need-based. Hezbollah is probably more familiar. We hear a lot in the media about the social programs, and people contend that this is what buys its support and so forth. It has quite a few bricks and mortar agencies, a lot of clinics, a lot of schools in its own official network and schools in another network that's linked to it, the Mustafa Schools Network. It runs its own hospitals. It has a well-known public works and constructive agency called Jihad al-Bina, which is the agency that has been involved in reconstructing parts of Lebanon that have been destroyed after Israeli attacks. It has an agency that's focused purely on poor families, the MDAD. It has institutions that are explicitly targeted for the families of martyrs from wars with Israel and the families of wounded from wars with Israel. And they make they don't attempt to hide the eligibility criteria here. The eligibility criteria are very direct. These extensive benefits, the most extensive benefits in its network, are reserved for those families only. And then it has ties to other charitable organizations, particularly in the Shia community. And in terms of eligibility requirements, like I mentioned, they're actually quite direct about the requirements for many of their programs, and they're the only organization that gave me data on what percentage of their beneficiaries are from their own community versus others. Everyone else didn't want to and claimed that they don't discriminate. So how did I research these questions? I used a variety of research methods. It was, I think, essential given the nature of the questions and given the difficulties of collecting data in Lebanon. One approach that I used was spatial analysis, GIS, very basic GIS analysis that I'll talk about today. I also ran an original national survey on access to welfare, which I could talk about if you're interested, that correlated access to different types of benefits with political behavior. I did a lot of interviews myself with elites from these parties and other relevant key informants, and then I had a team of Lebanese graduate students who interviewed each about 30 members of their own community. So it was like affirmative action. They were matched with people from their own community to interview them on their experiences in seeking welfare from these organizations. I visited a lot of institutions, and then there's some interesting materials that the parties themselves have published, sometimes for decades, newsletters about their activities and so forth. Okay, so let me just talk about why the spatial analysis and how it fits into this project. So I used the locations of these welfare agencies, the clinics, the schools, the hospitals of the sectarian parties as a measure of what types of communities these parties were trying to reach out to. And why is this measure valid? Well, first of all, people in Lebanon interpret the locations of these institutions as a strategic choice. In fact, I didn't go into Lebanon when I first started doing research on this project in 2006. I didn't go in there thinking, oh, I'm going to do spatial analysis. It came to me because when I was interviewing people, they said, well, just look at where they locate. Just look at where they locate. So, and it also happened that my university had a sort of spatial structures initiative that was helpful because they had a sort of crash course in this stuff. And another reason why I think location is a valid indicator is because it reflects a real commitment to a place and a community. I mean, these are bricks and mortar institutions. They require, long-term investments and serious capital outlays. So these are not sort of mobile distribution of cash benefits or food. It's something more committed to a community. Also, there's very little restriction on where these parties establish welfare agencies. I remember when I was interviewing someone in the Ministry of Public Health, he told me that they find out later after the fact that a sectarian party has set up an institution, even though there is an official licensing procedure. And once established, they basically continue to operate. As you may have guessed, why didn't I just, go and collect data on the sectarian profiles and so forth? It's because they didn't want to divulge this information themselves. These parties I was researching, they almost universally claimed non-discriminatory need-based criteria. And they also claimed that they first of all, they wouldn't reveal the profiles of their beneficiaries, even anonymized, and they claimed that they didn't collect data on the sectarian or political orientation of their beneficiaries. And, this is not surprising because sect is a very sensitive issue here. Okay, so there's a few implications of my arguments on the spatial level. And the one I'm going to focus on today in the interest of time is the sectarian composition of communities. So what are the communities like where these parties put their institutions? And just to give you a little idea of what this data looked like that I collected, this is a map of Lebanon, and it shows those lines, those boundaries depict the 1,644 administrative units in Lebanon. And this is a pretty small unit of analysis because Lebanon is smaller than the state of Connecticut. So these are pretty small units. Within Lebanon, these administrative units, which by the way are sort of similar to census tracts, aggregate into administrative districts called the Qaza, which are the foundation of most electoral laws that have been passed in Lebanon. And then in certain elections, the electoral laws changed, so the districts changed. But in the 2000-2005 elections, these units aggregated up into these 14 electoral districts. And so what I then gathered was various indicators at the zone level. One is the sectarian identity of registered voters, which the Ministry of Interior has. I also, for certain parts of the country, Beirut and Mount Lebanon, which account for about half the population, I gathered data on the sectarian identity of residents. So why do I distinguish between registered voters and residents? Because in Lebanon, you vote in your husband or father's, or if you're a man, your origin, a village or of origin or neighborhood of origin if you're from an urban area. And that doesn't always correspond to where you actually live, although most of the time it does. And I can talk about why I don't think this confounds my findings. And based on this data, I also calculated a measure of fractionalization at the zone level. So how mixed, how heterogeneous, or how homogeneous was the particular zone. And then I had some data on household socioeconomic status collected from marketing surveys in Beirut and Mount Lebanon. And then with the help of a research assistant, I constructed some other indicators from USAID data that proxy for socioeconomic status, like landlines, telephone landlines, and then also population density and land use. And I just want to mention, people who do spatial analysis in the U.S. sometimes say, well, census tracts are kind of arbitrary and meaningless because nobody knows what census tract they live in. I mean, I certainly don't know what census tract I live in. But actually, the zones for which I collected data are quite meaningful to people. I just pulled this map off of some tourism site in Lebanon. It shows you neighborhoods in the city of Beirut, and all those red names there that represent neighborhoods are the names of the zones that I collect data for. The same goes for rural areas with the names of villages. Okay, so just to give you a little taste of what I find, and we'll focus on these two first bars here, Future Movement and Hezbollah. The bottom here is different parties or types of organizations. Here is the percent of co-religionists in the zones where institutions are located. So how many people from the same community are in the zone where your organization establishes clinics, hospitals, or schools? And if you look at the Future Movement, you see that its institutions spread out across a number of different types of communities, ranging from very low co-religious communities to very high ones. Hezbollah tends to cluster more higher up towards more in-group communities, and this bar here is the median point. So 50% of institutions are located above and below, and what's interesting for Hezbollah is that median point is way up at the top. So basically, Hezbollah tends to locate institutions in more Shia areas, and Future Movement tends to locate in a broader array of areas. Just some descriptive statistics. In general, the zones that had a Hezbollah agency were 77% Shia on average, whereas zones with a future agency were 53% Sunni, so that's the in-group community on average. And there's a lower level of fractionalization in Hezbollah areas with party agencies than in future. But, someone could raise the question of whether this is simply an artifact of demographic spread, because Sunnis tend to live in more mixed areas and Shia tend to live in more clustered areas. I mean, they're both clustered. Spatial statistics show that all communities in Lebanon are clustered. But it is true that Sunnis tend to live in more urban areas than Shia, and so there might be more mixing of communities. So to deal with that, I did some very basic regressions using a technique called seemingly unrelated regression, since for those of you that are statistically inclined, I use this technique because in a few occasions, institutions belonging to different parties would be located in the same zone. So this was the most appropriate method for dealing with that. And the outcome was the presence or absence of an agency linked to one of these parties. The key variable of interest for me was fractionalization, so the degree of the degree to which the community is mixed or not. And then I did a variety of controls that control for the sectarian endowments of the population in that zone, to try to deal with this question of, controlling for the presence or the nature of the community. Do we still see variation in the degree to which these groups locate in more mixed or homogeneous areas? And then some of these socioeconomic variables. And let me just skip over this stuff quickly, just to say that there was a consistently negative association with mixed communities for Hezbollah agencies. So Hezbollah very decidedly does not locate it in mixed areas, and like all organizations, locates in in-group areas. This is not a distinguishing feature. All sectarian parties serve their own. That's not really in question here. The Future Movement generally had a positive association with mixed communities, so was more likely to associate with mixed communities after, or establish agencies in mixed communities after controlling for these demographic factors. To get back to the argument, why do we see this? And I argue that it relates to these different political mobilization strategies. The Future Movement has had a longer, more intensive focus on state-centric mobilization, and it has had a long series of incentives to focus on out-group targeting, whereas Hezbollah has historically emphasized more extra-state mobilization, and only more recently really fully turned towards more state-centric mobilization. And so it has a pattern of targeting in-group communities more exclusively. Let me just say a little bit about the history of these organizations, and to give this a little bit of flesh here. Incidentally, these are photos I love these photos because they're photos from the food distribution warehouse of the Future Movement. So this is the heart of the party operations. And these are boxes of food that, they generally include like lentils and rice and maybe household cleaning products and so forth. And it'll have, very clear credit claiming on these boxes. So, from the martyr Rafiq Hariri and so forth on these flyers that get distributed to families. So the Hariri Foundation started in 1979 under a different name in the southern Lebanese city of Sidon, which is where Hariri's from. And then it moved to Beirut in 1984. And every single biographer or study of Rafiq Hariri emphasizes his electoral ambitions, whether they love him, hate him. This is a sort of very well-known fact that very early on, during the Civil War even, Hariri had electoral ambitions. And there came to be a sort of political vacuum in the Sunni community and a sort of weakening of leadership that facilitated his rise as well. And some would argue that he facilitated the weakening of other Sunni leaders as well. So in the 1990s, the political wing was officially established, the Future Movement, but it was effectively operating under Hariri for a while, and the organization and Hariri as a political machine has always emphasized electoral mobilization. And with the possible exception of 2008, the Future Movement has not engaged in militia politics and has really worked through formal state institutions and is renowned for vote buying operations. It's not the only party that does it, but it's quite renowned for it. As I mentioned, there's some question about where the party went more recently, and there was these clashes some of you may have heard of in May of 2008, in which Future Security, which was a sort of proto-militia that the party put together, engaged in armed clashes with Hezbollah and others. It didn't do very well, and it was not a very well-developed militia force. That's probably actually too strong a word for it. But up until that point, and pretty much since then, it has been engaged in electoral mobilization. Hezbollah is probably more familiar to most people. It started in the early mid-1980s explicitly as a militia resistance movement, fighting Israeli attacks on Lebanon, and was part of a succession of Shia organizations that mobilized the historically marginalized Shia community. At that time, it competed with another Shia organization that has become a party, the ML movement. They've had, at least since 2000, an alliance with each other. And Hezbollah is very much the dominant partner in that alliance. In the post-war period, it increasingly contested elections, but it had a very ambivalent relationship with the central government until 2005. So it contested elections in every post-war national election starting in 1992, but it consistently refused to hold cabinet-level positions or be associated with the central government until 2005. And now it's actually in control of the government. And as I've said multiple times, it has emphasized extra state mobilization. I think we hear about the militia in the media quite a bit. It also is very well known for organizing mass demonstrations and sit-ins. It was the key organizer behind a sit-in that lasted for 17 months in Beirut in 2007. And I probably don't have time to go into this, but I'll just mention what it was. I did some case studies of particular communities where Hezbollah and Future do and do not provide social services. And I focused on those communities shaded in gray that are sort of paradoxical, because it's not surprising that Hezbollah or Future would serve in-group areas and would not serve out-group areas. What's more interesting is to look at the communities that have lots of people from their own community where they don't serve, and lots of people from other communities where they do serve. So I try to tease out the sort of local politics of their operations in these communities. And this is a whole other set of stories I don't have time to go into, but maybe I'll just mention one here, which is the example of the Hariri clinic in Karm Zaytun. Karm Zaytun is a neighborhood in Ashrafia, which is basically an entirely Christian area, especially after the war when you had homogenization of living patterns, increasingly so. And so it's purely Christian. And the Hariri Foundation came in 2000 and established a clinic there. And this was widely perceived as a political move because there were parliamentary elections coming up. And sure enough, you saw the Hariri Foundation rolling out these clinics in different neighborhoods. And when I did interviews with folks in those neighborhoods and with people who run other clinics and so forth, they said that, this was widely perceived in the community as a political move to build support, and that the prices of services would even drop during electoral cycles and go back up afterwards, and so forth. So that's the kind of sort of neighborhood level case study that I was doing. I'm going to skip over this stuff. I want to end not on a bad note by talking about the challenges. So I will acknowledge that there are challenges to spatial analysis. Partly it has to do with data limitations. I mean, Lebanon has not, for example, had a census since 1932. It's very politically, sensitive to have a census in a country like this, especially when political posts are allocated ex ante on sectarian lines. So that posed issues, among other things. And so what the long and short of it is that I tried to get around some of the criticisms that we might come up with by collecting data through a variety of methods and through mixing some qualitative findings with survey data that I collected and this spatial analysis stuff. But let me talk, I think, about some of the big questions here for the remaining few minutes that this raised for me and how this is leading into some new research projects. Some of you who follow the literature on political Islam and the participation of Islamist movements in politics may be familiar with this moderation inclusion hypothesis. And some people argue that when these parties participate in mainstream electoral state-centric politics, then they're more likely to moderate, whether that means along tactical lines or ideological lines. And I think there's been some very interesting work recently that calls into question that argument, and I would say I come down in agreement with the questioning of that argument because in order for these groups to be included, they have to choose to be included in the first place. So there's a sort of endogeneity going on in this argument because only those organizations that opt to participate in electoral politics are going to have the opportunity to be moderated through this mechanism in the first place. And I think, when we look at the case of Hezbollah, it's very clear that it has participated increasingly in elections, but that came out of a party decision to participate. And so whatever moderation has ensued in terms of reaching out across party lines, forming alliances with other non-Shia parties and so forth, is, as much a product of party decision-making as it is due to participation in the political process. And also, something I'm trying to puzzle through for the conclusion of this book, which I'm in the final stages of revising, is, what are the implications for intergroup relations and possibly even sectarian violence? This is something that one of the reviewers was raising. And, in particular, what are the effects of formal institutions and political participation on intergroup relations and sectarian violence? And so this one I'm having, a tough one puzzling through because, again, similar to my answer previously, parties make these strategic and ideological decisions to participate, to cooperate with other groups in the first place. And so to the extent that moderation occurs or that intergroup relations improve, I think it's probably through a reinforcing dynamic of political participation that ensues, but not necessarily because they were included in the first place and then started to moderate. So to me, it seems likely that to the extent to which there is moderation, it occurs after parties have decided to moderate on some level and then is reinforced by their participation in formal state and electoral politics. Some other things that I think are really interesting here are, so what does all this non-state welfare mean for big picture things like national integration? And one of the sectors that I looked at was education. So I went to a lot of schools run by these organizations, and the question I always asked them was, can you tell me what your history curriculum is? What history do you teach? And it turns out that these schools are all teaching different versions of Lebanese history. And they won't give me their textbooks. They claim that they're all, and this is not unique to sectarian parties, it's the religious schools as well, that they have to make up their own sheets and handouts on Lebanese history. So they'll teach French history, they'll teach, European history, but when it comes to the history of their own country, they each make up their own version of history, and it differs from place to place. So this, there's been a fair amount of scholarship by Lebanese education specialists that shows the detrimental effects of this and so forth, and I think that's just one dimension, but one might make the argument that there are detrimental effects from other forms of services as well, from healthcare by different providers and so forth, although I think the socialization effect isn't there to the same degree. Another thing that I've been looking at, and my survey that I ran really gets at this, is access to social benefits. And, the public health literature, for example, looks at all kinds of socioeconomic factors, gender, race, and so forth, that affect your access to healthcare and health outcomes, such as in the literature on social determinants of health. And one thing that I've been finding here, and I definitely don't think it's unique to the Lebanese case, is that partisanship and political loyalties are associated with differential access to social benefits. So I think there's another sort of dimension that speaks to welfare politics as well. So that leads to some new research that I'm embarking on now that looks at non-state actors and welfare regimes. And in particular, if you look at the second question, what types of providers provide the best quality of care? This is one of the major research things, agendas that I'm working on now. There's a health economist at the World Bank named Jishnu Das who does really interesting work measuring the quality of health care, starting in rural India, but it's been rolled out to a bunch of different other places. And so what I'm doing now, and I've got a lot of materials from him and advice from him, I'm working with colleagues at Brown and also at the American University of Beirut to adapt this research to pilot it in Lebanon this spring and summer. I'm waiting on the IRB approval. And then the goal is to roll it out in multiple Middle Eastern countries. And so we'd be looking systematically at the quality of healthcare at primary healthcare clinics across different types of providers. So public sector clinics, but also clinics run by religious charities, by political organizations like the sectarian parties I'm looking at, NGOs, and private for-profit providers. And part of this has to do, so this is not just a public health project, although I have a bunch of collaborators in public health. Part of it has to do with my interest in Islamist governance and welfare regimes more generally. And one thing that I found across the board, and I've read this about other organizations, similar political religious organizations like the BJP in India, is that these groups have a reputation for providing good quality health services, and that's one of the reasons why they attract support. So I heard this time and time again, but nobody has ever systematically tested this. We simply have no idea. It's an assertion that's out there. And so I think that this methodology that I've just mentioned is actually quite amenable to testing that systematically. And if indeed we do find that Hezbollah, for example, does provide welfare better, then why? I think there's some interesting questions to look at. What is it about the organization or its ideology or whatever it might be? I have some thoughts on this, but no time to go into it, that lends itself to high-quality service provision. And incidentally, I should mention that I have the backing of the Ministry of Public Health in Lebanon for this project, and I'm working with the number 2 person there. And he said to me, you're going to find that Hezbollah does the best health care in this country. So we'll see if that's true. Okay, and then finally, another question that I've wanted to answer for a long time, but is really hard to ask and answer, is what's the political impact social service provision by these groups, by Islamists and others, on their beneficiaries. And we make a lot of claims about, they buy social support and so forth, but we really don't know that systematically. So when and how does the receipt of health care, that's what I'm focusing on in this next work in particular, how does it shape political behavior, voting behavior, propensity to participate in, demonstrations, to attend meetings and so forth. And I have some preliminary ideas about how to work on this question, potentially with a survey experiment, but also something that's happened recently to the Future movement might provide a nice opportunity for me. So I mentioned that the Future movement was in this, when I was collecting my data, it was expanding. It had 30 plus clinics and so forth. But in the last year or so, it's reached a sort of crisis point, largely because of problems in its leadership. And some of this has had fiscal, financial implications. And so I recently learned that it was forced to close a couple of its clinics. So I think this provides a nice opportunity for me because I can look at electoral returns in the districts where they operated in 2009 and then again in the upcoming 2013 elections and see if we see differences in electoral support for the party in similar communities over time. So that's what I'm thinking of to get at these thorny questions, which are very difficult because it's hard to untangle whether these groups are rewarding existing supporters or are actually attracting support with these services and so forth. So I'll stop there and see if anyone has any questions. Thank you.